Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erica. And before we start, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, or stream us on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter/X, and TikTok too. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com.
Yes. And one last reminder to enter our giveaway to win a copy of the new Mind Games remixes. Just go to bcthebeatles.com, click on the monthly giveaway link on the left side of the homepage, and enter by August 12th. And speaking of August was often a month full of significant changes for the Beatles. In August of 1962, Pete Best was fired, and Ringo joined the band, completing the lineup and creating the chemistry that propelled them to worldwide stardom. August 1966 brought the backlash against John's more popular than Jesus comments and marked the end of their touring career. And of course, the death of Brian Epstein in August of 1967 was a tragic loss that in many ways signified the beginning of the end for the Beatles. But August of 1960 was more like the beginning of the beginning, with the Beatles heading off to Hamburg for the very first time. These intense experiences honed their skills in ways they never thought possible and permanently changed them as both musicians and as people. We're taking a couple of weeks off for the summer, and we'll be back with new episodes later in the month. So in the meantime, and in honor of this transformative month in Beatles history, here's an encore episode of MACH, SCHAU, the Beatles in 1960.
'60, at a quick glance, when we were writing this episode, we both sort of went into it being like, oh, there's probably not that much. Like 60, it doesn't really come up that much in the Beatles story. But surprisingly, it actually is kind of important. Just to recap the last couple of years leading up to 1960. So John and Paul met 1957, but they didn't meet Brian or add Ringo formally as a Beatle till 61. So history sort of like glosses over this year, but it's really the year that kind of set everything for the next decade. It really was the year where everything became poised to fall into place.
I think the theme of 1960 was really transition. It was the year that they came into their own. I mean, in the 50s, they were these awkward teddy boys. They had unsure futures. Who knows what was going to happen? And in this year of 1960, they moved from these unsure young boys to these self-assured, badass powerhouses in leather who managed to harness that sense of Beatleness that we all know today in this short year.
Yeah, and Beatleness is a great word. And if you're curious to know a little bit more about that, check out our episode with Candy Leonard. She actually wrote a book called Beatleness about Beatles fans. But in this case, it's like, what do you think about in that period? It's them in their cavern leathers, as they call them, becoming this like wild bunch of boys that Brian would discover the next year. I think this was a very important period for them.
And not only did they refine their sound, they refined their look with the help of people they met there, including Astrid Karacher and their friend Klaus Voormann.
Did we talk about Hamburg yet?
I don't think we've talked about Hamburg at all. So, Allison, who were Astrid and Klaus?
Okay, well, quick sidebar. I took German in high school and I chose Astrid as my name because of this. Anyway, I love her. Astrid was a photographer in Hamburg, Germany, and the Beatles spent a big chunk of 1960 doing their first run of Hamburg shows. And not only did she really take the first official images of the band, we'll post some of those on our social. They're super well known. You've seen them. They're iconic. But she and her former boyfriend turned BFF, Klaus Voormann, who definitely needs his own episode because he shows up all along the way of the Beatles story. Those two really revolutionized their look because they had these short, bowl-cut hairstyles and they had existential looks where they dressed all in black in these like sleek outfits. And John would call them Exies because of existentialism. And Stuart Sutcliffe, who we'll get to in a second, we have a whole episode about him. He was in the band during this period and he fell in love with Astrid and he stayed behind in Hamburg when the Beatles went back to Liverpool and he quit the Beatles to be with her. That's so romantic.
It is romantic. And it's interesting, too, that not only that it was a turning point for him, but it was a turning point for the band. It was kind of a time where they went from their friends. And, there's a story where Stu was an artist and he won a painting contest, and John cajoled him to use this hard-earned money he won his painting to buy a bass to join their band to be with them. But Stewart himself, he was never a dedicated musician. He was doing it for the love of his friend. So when Stewart ended up making the choice to stay behind, they started really solidifying into hardcore musicians, first with Pete, then with Ringo.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've done an episode or we've talked about it in length. We should definitely talk about this, how Paul sort of rose throughout the years to becoming the leader of the Beatles, even though everybody perceives John to be. It's such a great topic. I think this is where that begins, because Paul and Stu were always, I don't know if Stu was really jealous of Paul or Paul and John's friendship, but I think Paul was always really jealous of John and Stu. So when Stu sort of stayed back in Germany and removed that competition for Paul to come into John's life and for them to solidify their connection. So that was a really important, obviously, event that happened.
There's a lot of things I think we could talk about the relationship between Paul and Stu and John, and Paul and Pete and John. There's interesting dynamics there.
I know, which is ironic. I think a lot of what happens in 1960 needs its own episode because there's a lot. It's very crazy.
And I think one of the first things that we see, at least from the viewpoint of history, is that we get some of the first real recordings of these early Beatles. And the first recording was when they recorded a record together, I think 2 years before that. And they did That'll Be the Day. And what was on the other side of that?
Was it In Spite of All the Danger?
Yes, it was In Spite of All the Danger. But this was the first home recordings of the Beatles, which they did mostly in Paul's bathroom. I think there was another session that Astrid did with them, too, a little later in the year. I find these really interesting because for two things. The first is that it's one of these things where it's just ridiculous kismet that in 1960, we actually have a bathroom recording of the Beatles. Given the technology and the ability to do something like that and how hard it was to record things, the number of early recordings we have of the Beatles, starting with that very, very muffled recording on that day when John was the first time that Paul met John. And then they were able to put their money together and make a little record together the next year. And then they got a reel-to-reel player and they just made a bunch of recordings. And I think that's really fascinating because it's surprising that you have it. I would imagine that the majority of bands playing in 1960 do not have audio evidence of their band. And we have it of the Beatles.
We need to talk about Paul's bathroom for a second, because if you remember in Carpool Karaoke, when they go to Paul's house, he talks about recording in the bathroom and how the acoustics are great. And I think he actually sits in his bathroom and sings a little bit. So
He does.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So go back to, the Carpool Karaoke episode and you'll see Paul. And in the very first place, the Beatles made some home recordings, I guess.
These home recordings they're not amazing, but you really can hear what is going to come. I would imagine that if they had made a recording in that bathroom a year later, you could really hear the difference that having gone to Hamburg later in that year would have made.
Oh, yeah. That would have been amazing. They should have done that every year, like a family portrait, a yearly bathroom recording.
And also interesting, and we'll post this on the social because there's a hour-long compilation on YouTube of all these things. But some of the things that you hear, they did one after 909. They did I'll Follow the Sun. So they were already really confident in the ability to write and the ability to record those songs they wrote.
That's so interesting because One After 909 shows up so many times throughout their career, even to the very end. That's such a fascinating tune that they kept coming back to it like that. I don't think they formally recorded it for an album until Let It Be.
Yeah, they did not.
But it shows up on, I think, Live at the BBC. They do it there or something like that. Coming into 1960, they were still the Quarrymen, the band named after Quarry Bank High School, where John and Stu went to school. They decided in early May to change their name to the Silver Beatles, Beetles. The first thing they do is they audition to support Billy Fury, who was a big personality on Liverpool music scene. They have a big statue to him. If you go to Liverpool, it's down on Albert Dock. So they auditioned to support him. as his band on tour, but they don't get the gig. But instead, they do get the gig to back Johnny Gentle on his tour of Scotland. And I was like, wait, all my years of being a Beatles fan, I don't know who the hell Johnny Gentle is. So I looked it up. And really, the most famous thing about him is that his backing band on this tour is the Beatles. Like,
yes,
he even wrote a book about it. That's all you need to know about Johnny Gentle, apparently. But on this tour, this is one of my favorite Beatles things. They adopt pseudonyms for some reason. They just decide to like change it up. So John Lennon becomes Long John Silver Beatles. I could see it. Paul becomes Paul Ramon. Fun fact, this actually inspired the Ramones. This is where they got their name, as from Paul Ramon.
Oh, how cool is that?
That's crazy. The Ramones are such Beatle nerds. I love them so much. George Harrison becomes Carl Harrison. He adopts Carl Perkins' first name. Loved Carl Perkins.
How cute is that? What a guitar nerd he was.
Oh, I know. I love his Carl Perkins love. So sweet. Stuart becomes Stuart de Stael after an abstract painter named Nicholas de Stael. And actually, Stuart's works have been compared to his. So it was apt and appropriately arty for Stu.
Yeah.
And then on drums, I don't think he had a cool nickname, but was Tommy Moore. But he quit the band shortly after the tour ends.
Tommy Moore was only there for a little bit. He was much older than the rest of the Beatles, and he had a day job, and he had a wife, and his wife did not like being part of this band.
No way, really? I can't believe it.
After Tommy Moore, they really did embark on one of the key milestones in the early Beatles' career, which is that they hired Pete Best as the drummer for what was then known as the Silver Beatles.
Hi, Pete. Enter Pete.
Hello, Pete. One of the interesting things about Pete was that it really was this transition from a group of friends to a group of musicians, because they basically hired him because he had a drum kit.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed a drummer to go to Hamburg when they were offered the Hamburg gig first, and they needed a drummer. So they needed to find somebody who could come on short notice and could drum and had a drum kit. And that's what they found.
Yeah, he didn't suck too bad. So he kind of got the gig, which is great. So they knew Pete because they sort of circled around the same friend groups and bands, and especially at the Casbah Club, which was run by Pete's mother, Mona, who definitely needs her own episode, because Mona is one of those very overlooked figures in not only Beatle history, but Liverpool music history. Proprietor of the Casbah, very supportive. I mean, she would like go to bat for her son like nobody else. Like I think she may have like told Brian off or something after he fired Pete. But she was very, very powerful, especially as a woman in that scene.
She was definitely a mama bear, and she had her own club, which is very interesting for a woman in Liverpool in 1960. And the Beatles were very much involved with that. I mean, Paul recounts how he and the other guys helped paint the ceilings and decorate it and make it what it was.
Yeah, and if you go to the Casbah today, you can still see it. They have the painted ceiling and the walls and everything. It's all preserved, which is fucking great. I mean, there's so much of that. Obviously, the cavern's gone, the original cavern, all of that. But the Casbah is still pretty much exactly as it was when the Beatles played there.
That's amazing.
Yeah, right?
And then soon after that, the Beatles start with the wordplay that so defined John Lennon and that defined their name. So from the Silver Beatles, like the bug, on August 17th, so the rumor goes, they changed their name to just Beatles, Beatles. And it's for two reasons from what we hear. Is that the first was it was an interesting wordplay on beat and beat music. And I think Stu came up with that part of it with the alternate spelling.
Yeah.
And then it was also inspired by the Beatles, especially John's love of Buddy Holly, who was Buddy Holly and the Crickets.
Love that. I love Buddy, so I agree with this. And then around the same time, mid-August, they go to Hamburg. They embark on a very arduous journey. My God, it was like a train to London, boat to Holland, train or a boat to Germany. It's like, when you think we can just hop on a plane and be somewhere in like 5 hours, like it's 5 hours from New York to London. It really puts into perspective how tiring and kind of treacherous and unpredictable this kind of trip would have been.
Plus, they had all their own gear and their clothes and everything. I mean, they were carting this stuff around.
Yeah, definitely. So when they get to Hamburg, they already have a gig lined up for them at the Indra Club. and they end up playing there for 48 days. That seems so long. I don't think I realized before this episode how long they were at these clubs. That's what, like a month and a half? And sometimes multiple shows.
This was not a nice place. I think they were in like a closet next to the women's bathroom, and they had to bathe in the sink because they didn't actually have a shower. They weren't exactly being put up with a nice cushy rider at a 5-star hotel.
Then people started bitching about the noise at the Indra. I mean, what do you expect, guys? Come on. So they move over to the Kaiser Keller. They're there for 58 days. And this is where they learn from Herr, I'm going to say this name wrong, Hirschmoller? I don't know. I took German. One of his infamous phrases to Beatle fans is to MACH SCHAU, which directly translates into make show, but is his way of hurrying their asses on stage to play God knows how many shows per night and entertain his guests.
And MACH SCHAU, they did. I think they've really, really honed their performance skills. They already had ridiculous senses of humor, and they were funny, and they were irreverent, but playing all night on the influence of lots and lots of drugs and a lot of speed. I think they discovered how drugs influenced music for the first time during these...
Prellies.
Preludin, which is a form of speed, which they got from both Astrid's mother, who got a back channel prescription from a pharmacist.
Oh, my God.
As well as from the bathroom attendant at the club, who was affectionately known as Mama, who had it in a big basket that she would just pass out to all of them.
I don't think I knew the thing about Astrid's mom.
Yeah.
And Prellies.
Mm-hmm.
Shit. Cool mom.
Yeah.
Don't do drugs. Drugs are bad. Wow. That's crazy. And as the famous story goes, during this time, I don't know if it was the club, Erica, maybe you know more about this, but George loses his virginity. And apparently his bandmates were in the room. And after it was over, they applauded him.
That is how the story goes.
Yeah.
George was underage. He was only 17. And he lost his virginity there. Yeah. And they were proud of him. They were really proud of him.
Oh, my God. That's so funny. I think George himself tells the story in the anthology. Like, he corroborates that he just doesn't have any shame. Like, whatever the fuck. Yeah. So funny. Oh, my goodness. So moving on from the George losing his virginity, and we'll give him a little clap. As we talked about, this is where we have some recording happening. Yay. And one of the things, sort of a pre-telling of things to come, John, Paul, and George, they plan a backing track for a guy called Lou Walters, and he is in Roy Storm and the Hurricanes. And who is the drummer of Roy Storm and the Hurricanes at this time? Of course, it is Ringo. Ringo, this really tough guy. They were very afraid of him, which is very funny.
Yeah, he was tough and super talented, and with the Hurricanes, who were known as the best band in Liverpool, and preceded them at Hamburg.
Mersey Beat wasn't around yet, but I think there was a poll taken in Liverpool around this time where Rory Storm was number 1 and the Beatles were number 2. They were the fan favorites. And so John, Paul, and George joined Ringo on this demo. And it's the first time what would be the final lineup of the Beatles they play together. The songs are Summertime and possibly Fever and September Song, which I love September Song so much. But you know what? There's no recordings that have survived, which
it's the worst.
Makes me so mad.
Never give up, though. Never say never. You never know what's hidden in a breadbasket or something in somebody's house.
That's like our mantra here on the podcast. It's like, go look in your grandparents' junk drawers. There might be a tape in there of this session, especially if your last name's Walters and a relative was in a band in Liverpool.
So that demo was in October. And shortly thereafter, things take a turn for the not as good for them, as George is deported for being underage. Apparently, losing your virginity on German soil does not make you enough of a man to be able to stay if you're still 17.
I guess not. And it was super duper bad timing because they'd just been courted to work at the much more prestigious Top 10 club. Like, this was a super upgrade from the Kaiser Keller. George talks about in the anthology about when he got deported, it literally took him 24 hours to get home because, as we talked about, he's taking a train to a boat to another train and all this stuff. And he said he was almost broke by the time he finally got back to Liverpool. So, I mean, I can't imagine how defeated he felt and how freaking defeated the Beatles felt, seeing George get shipped off back home. I always think about Backbeat and a couple of other Beatle biopics when they deport George being literally yanked off the stage and sent back. I'm sure it was not that dramatic, but no less devastating.
I wonder if it had something to do. I feel like it did, that they were being courted by the top 10. They were going to move off from the Kaiser Keller. And I wonder if somebody just kind of notified the authorities.
Ooh, that is very weird timing. You're right.
Yeah, because who the fuck cares if he's 17? Like, why is this all of a sudden a thing?
Yeah, I'm sure he's not the only 17-year-old musician.
And he did sign a contract.
Playing.
He'd been there for a while at that point. Who's finding this out now?
That is, conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, luckily, other Beatles were still behind, though, to wreak havoc.
And wreak havoc they did.
Yes. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out so well for them either. On November 30th of 1960, Paul and Pete are deported after setting a fire with a condom nailed to the wall as a big fuck you to the living conditions they were being put up in.
Well, Erica, that's one version of it. Just to play devil's advocate, I like that story too. But their accounts differ. Was it a rag? Was it a tapestry? Or, as the legend goes, a condom nailed to the wall? And I think Paul has even said, I mean, I don't think he's ever confirmed nor denied, but I feel like he hints to it being a condom. And people say it was because they just moved into these new digs because they were going to play the top 10 club and they couldn't see. It was dark in the room. And so they're like, what can we set on fire? Which seems implausible and illogical. But these are the Beatles we're talking about. So who knows? And so they set something on fire on the wall. And apparently the fire wasn't even a big deal. It sort of burned itself out in like 2 seconds. But it was enough to get them arrested. So I don't know. I stand on the condom and the fuck you, but it just makes a good story.
Well, I'm going to keep on the conspiracy theory train. And I'm just going to say that I think that the fire was small, but somebody was pissed. And they just wanted to keep getting these troublemakers out.
That is, oh my gosh, you're like building a whole like secret history right here. This is great. Okay, yeah, I'm into this. I didn't know we would go there, but I'm really happy with this. Oh my God. Well, Paul and Pete stand and follow George's lead and they get deported. Bye-bye. And so I guess John is kind of hanging out back there with Stu. Stu's like, dude, I'm going to stay here with my girlfriend. Like, I'm sorry, I'm quitting the Beatles. And cue many dramatic scenes in Beatles biopics where John like fights with Stu and Stu's just like, LOL, you simpleton, I'm an artsy genius and I'm going to stay here with my existential like smart friends. And John sulks back to Liverpool. Probably wasn't like that because they would hang out on subsequent Hamburg trips and all that. But by early December, John is back in Liverpool. So we've got all the Beatles minus Stu back in Liverpool.
They're back and they're different. This year of 1960 has changed them. They are not the same guys that were recording in Paul's bathroom in April. They are leather. They have this existential look. Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blank, uses the Beatles as an example of how 10,000 hours of practice on average can make you an expert. And that's a very simplified way to say it, but he uses this example of how the Beatles were nonstop playing in that time in Hamburg. And in their first year, I mean, how many nights did they play? 8 hours a night. You know?
Yeah.
So they got a boot camp of training and they came back a totally different band in just a few short months. They were, in fact, so unrecognizable that on their first gig back, they were billed as direct from Hamburg. A lot of people in the audience thought they were actually a German import, not their Beatles. I find that their second to last gig of the year on December 27th in Litherland Town Hall was the culmination of what 1960 was for the Beatles. And it was, in essence, the beginning of Beatlemania as we know it. The Beatles just back from Hamburg with this new look, direct from Hamburg, as they say. The lineup was John, Paul, George, Pete, and former Quarryman Chaz Newby filling in on bass since Stu had stayed behind. They were playing at Litherland Town Hall. local venue. And actually, both Johnny Guitar and Ringo Starr from Roy Storm and the Hurricane were in the audience that night, having themselves just gotten back from Hamburg. The story goes, and I find this such a very exciting story, is that the Beatles were there. They were actually a bit nervous having come back and playing their hometown after so many months of not being around. And their friend of the band, Bob Wooler, whose legend looms large in Beatles history.
Mm-hmm. Another episode we should do.
Yes. He was the DJ that night in Litherland Town Hall, and he advised the band that when he announced them, they should come on strong. And come on strong, they did. Especially Paul, who actually misheard the cue a little bit, and he jumped the gun, and he ripped into his signature Long Tall Sally early, giving his English audience this first taste, this first thrill of the orgasmic pull that would become Beatlemania. And according to primary accounts, the audience was at first totally stunned into silence. The bouncers kind of moved forward, prepping themselves for the inevitable fights that was going to happen. But there were no fights. Instead, the fans rushed the stage, screaming their faces off, dancing, and engulfed by that euphoria that 60 years later, we're still feeling.
That's amazing. And I mean, what a song to start off with. And, you know, if you've ever seen like a Beatles tribute band do it, it's even exciting when it's not the real Beatles. I can't imagine seeing like a young, fresh out of Hamburg Paul McCartney just like tearing into the song. I imagine like no matter what the audience had seen in the cavern or around the city at this time when Mersey Beat was coming alive, that would have been like, holy shit, like what is going on?
I mean, I can't even imagine the electricity that was in that room that night.
Right. And I know a lot of people, when they make their pilgrimage to Liverpool, they do hit up Litherland. And I would like to at some point. I think it's out in the Wirral, which is a little bit outside of the city center. But it's such an important and overlooked venue in the Beatles' history.
That year, that incredible year, laid an amazing groundwork for what we came to know as the Beatles.
It's crazy because people often talk about the Beatles like they, as a band, packed so much into a decade. Like they went through how many transitions of their looks, their music. They, you know, revolutionized culture like in 10 years, which is not that long. I mean, 10 years goes by like that. And in 1 year, they started the year as a band recording simple tracks in like Paul's bathroom, as you said. And they go and create this like frenzy at the end that's going to snowball into 61, where a lot changes. And then obviously 62, 63, it's pretty phenomenal. They were always just like pouncing on the next thing. And I think that momentum is amazing.
And think about like what did 1960 establish for them? I mean, it established their haircut and their style.
Yeah.
Even though they got out of the leather, that Beatle bowl cut was a remnant of what Astrid did for them in Germany. And I mean, I would say that probably the attraction of the boys in leather was one of the main attractions when Brian saw their look, even though he changed it. That is certainly a shock to the system, I would imagine.
Oh, definitely.
And they built up a huge repertoire of songs out of necessity because they couldn't just keep doing the same 20-minute set if they had an 8-hour show every night. So they did their covers. They worked on these originals, many of which made their way into Beatles albums, or they're just inspiration for their own songs. I mean, if you look at something like Long Tall Sally, now, of course, it slipped in my mind. What is the song that he did?
What do you mean? I'm Down?
Yes. So if you look at Long Tall Sally.
Hey, I got it.
Yeah, you got it immediately. I'm Down. Is that song would not have been written had Paul not been so immersed in this music that he loves so much and doing all of these covers.
And let's not forget, this is where they first like really found out about the druggies and the Pirellis and what an effect those had on the life of a performer, especially when you're pushing your body to the limit, performing so long and for, you know, so many nights at one time.
And whatever your opinion is on drugs, it can't be denied that the Beatles used drugs to their advantage musically, whether it was the speed or whether it was weed or whether it was psychedelics later on. I mean, they did, and this was the first time they ever did.
Plus, they made so many connections. You know, they first encountered, I mean, really kind of in close quarters with Ringo. They had obviously seen him around the scene in Liverpool, but when you're thrown together in a foreign country playing all these shows, it's like you really get to bond with people, and it's almost like being in war together.
And also, what an odd thing that in 1960, 15, 16-ish years after World War II, that England was sending all of these musical acts over to Germany. It's a strange thing. And I'm sure that it really tickled John's sense of humor because he always loved Nazi jokes.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So I think he did enjoy it. He would stomp around calling them fucking Nazis in English, and they couldn't understand and everything, and doing the Hitler walk and goose steps and the mustache and everything. So I'm sure that he did enjoy that quite a bit.
Oh my God, John. What's going to do with you? Naughty boy.
I know.
My God. But yeah, I mean, guys, 1960, a lot more than we thought it was going to be.
Yeah, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. 1960 was a great, crazy year. So I would advise anybody who's interested in early Beatles, don't skip 1960 because it's really, really formative.
Absolutely. And we'll probably touch on Hamburg a lot, in this podcast.
The early Beatle time is so interesting. I mean, not only because of the speed and pace at which they went at such a young age, but also just the optimism and the kismet and the ridiculously impossible things that happened to make this story happened for the most part in this 5-year period between 1957 and 1962.
Yeah.
And that's our episode for today. Thanks so much for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com too.
And don't forget to get your entries in for the Mind Games giveaway by this coming Monday, August 12th.
And we will see you next time.
Bye.